Okay, so now we know what API routes are, that we can write server-side code there, Node.js code to be specific, that we can handle different kinds of requests, that we can extract data and then run any kind of Node.js code we want. We can then also send back a response or different responses depending on the kind of request sent. So for example, if I still enter a request and send it to /API/feedback through the browser URL bar, that will automatically be a GET request. Therefore, it will not trigger this if block, or it'll not make it into this if block because the method is not post, but GET. And therefore, this line of code will execute, which is why we see this response. And now that we got this response, of course, let me also make it crystal clear that you can also handle incoming GET requests in whichever way you want. So for example here, let's say for incoming GET requests, we wanna get access to all our feedback objects that were stored and return those as JSON. So that in our front-end application, we could also send a behind-the-scenes request to fetch all feedback entries and display them on the screen. So to achieve this in our API feedback route, I will basically repeat the code from up there to get access to my file. And hence we can copy that code, or to avoid code duplication, create helper functions like build feedback path, let's say, where I simply return this file path which I create here. So where I return this so that down there we can just execute build feedback path and then do this again here in the else block. And also to then get our file data, we can create another function. Extract feedback could be the function name. And in extract feedback, I, in the end, want to execute that code. So we can copy that code, move that in there, expect the file path as a parameter, and then simply return the parsed data as a response. And then below here in that code, we can now get our data by calling extract feedback and passing our file path as an argument. With that refactoring, we can repeat that down here in the else block. And then we got that extracted and parsed feedback data in that data constant. And hence, instead of sending back this dummy "this works" message, we could send back our feedback, our data, which we're extracting from the feedback file. And if we do that and save this, if I now reload /API/feedback, we see that this also works. But of course, we typically don't add an API route so that users have to enter them in their URL bar. That's not the user experience we typically want to offer. Instead, maybe on localhost /3000, we want to have a button that loads all the stored feedback items from that API route, or with help of that API route, when it's clicked. So on index.js, below the form, I'll add a horizontal line and then a button where I say load feedback. And when that button is clicked, I want to send a GET request to my feedback API route to trigger this else block and get that feedback data. For this, in the front end, in index.js, in my homepage component, I add another function which should be triggered when this new button is clicked. And that could be the load feedback handler function. Name is up to you. And in there, I also want to send a fetch request to /API feedback. So I will actually copy that code from up there and paste it in here, but I'll not set this configuration object because here I do want to send a GET request. I have no extra data that should be added to the request, and I therefore also don't need to set any headers. So just sending a GET request by just passing in the URL is enough. Now let's connect this load feedback handler to this button here through the onClick prop. load feedback handler. And then we can, of course, do more useful things with our data here as well. Currently, we're just logging it to the console. We could also set some state that renders the feedback items. So let's maybe do that. Let's import use state from React, and let's register some state here by calling use state. And let's say initially we have an empty array for our feedback items state, and then a set feedback items updating function. So that could be state which we now use in the homepage component. And now I want to set my state whenever I did fetch my feedback data. So then here in the load feedback handler, instead of logging the feedback to the console, I'll call set feedback items to update that feedback state. And I want to update it with that data that was fetched. Now keep in mind that the data we're sending back will be an object with a feedback property which holds the actual data parsed from the feedback JSON file, and therefore it's this feedback property which will give us access to that feedback array stored in that file. Hence, when we work with our response data on the front end, we want to set data.feedback as our feedback items, because that is then accessing that feedback property which is being set on the response and which therefore does hold those feedback items in that array. And now we're setting that state, and we can now use that state in our homepage component below the button to simply output an unordered list of feedback items which we map to list items, where I then, for example, simply output item.text, because my feedback items, as stored in feedback JSON, do have a text property, and these are the items we're working with here, so we can output the text here, and since we're mapping, also set a key to item.id as a unique identifier per item. With all that implemented, if we save everything again, if I click load feedback, you see that data shows up here. And if I reload the page and open the network tab, you see that if I click load feedback, a request is sent to feedback. It's a GET request to my domain /API/feedback. And there on the response, you see we got that feedback data as JSON. So that is how we can then also send a GET request to an API route. And the special thing here is that we do this behind the scenes with JavaScript on the already loaded page.